Queen of Ravens, Book 1, The Great Game, a companion series to the Neververse by David Stone. Prologue. Dear reader, I bid you the warmest of greetings from your humble servant, Attir Ravenclaw. I feel it is my duty to forewarn you that some events retold in these pages will be disturbing for some, for I have not gussied up the truth and left it raw and unsweetened in most cases. This may be uncomfortable for some readers, and indeed play upon their own experiences. If you are one of these people, my sincere apologies, sympathy, and love, and I can only hope that one day you receive help in finding some peace with them. And truly, I am not without sympathy, for I too have suffered abuse of many kinds. But if you are of the persuasion that feels offence at things for no other reason than to make a fuss, then these books are not for you, and I might suggest books on flower arranging or pottery rather than uncensored Naxian history. Much has been written about the last years of the great empires of Naxia and Shăr, but little of it contains a truly deep account of the actual events that led to a brief unification of the Middle Kingdoms and the eventual end of dynastic rule some 150 years later. Indeed, it is of my opinion that what information still exists is little more than half-truths and misunderstandings of what really occurred. Why the House of the Raven rose and fell so quickly, or indeed the infamous Countess of Oshelila, along with a dozen of the most influential nobles, vanished without a trace, is wildly inaccurate and a pure fabrication in most cases. My goal is to dispel the half-truths, push back the veil of myth around these events, and bring to light the lives of my sisters, friends, and parents. Contrary to the learned men of this age, the Elin were no myth, and to the zealously religious, I regret to inform you that Elissa and her sister were not gods, that my father and his brother, while great men, were men with many flaws, and my sister Issa and her dear friend Zirana were no less flawed for all the great works they would eventually do. Indeed, it is true that the Spider of Shăr and Zirana de Mengia are the same person, and not two different mythical beings as the bards would later retell. That Elia Ravenhair and Natanya Finehair were not the same person at all, but two influential leaders in their own right now all muddled up with each other. It feels truly strange for one who lived through these events to argue with those who did not, but I can hardly blame you all for it. They happened nearly 1,000 years before I finally finished these accounts, and the wheels of time and industry ground on forever, changing the world I once knew, even if I did not change with it. So, in these pages, you will find my accounting of the events that led to the fall of the House of the Raven and the end of the old empires, through my diaries, those of my sisters, and conversations with what little of our family remained. I have worked tirelessly to recount those events. There are many myths, half-truths, and indeed outright lies surrounding my father and his brothers' lives, and also that of my mother, for in point of fact, I had two, and Emma was not my birth mother, as some would later retell. Here within these pages, I seek to dispel those lies. My adopted mother was not as ruthless as the bards would later tell you, and my father was not as infallible as the old songs and stories would have you think. Indeed, it is hard to extract the myth from either, and no less so from my esteemed sisters. Few can imagine the life of a court girl or woman now, especially when placed against the so-called enlightened age. It was not one of ease, even if it was one of privilege, when compared to the common people of the time. The life was rigid and often cruel, and so it follows that the women it produced were all too often much the same. We do what we must was as much our maxim as it was an excuse for our actions in the great game of house. So we struggled, we fought, and we destroyed lives, in the end even our own, for the power, wealth, and the thrones of the great cities. Even now I shudder at the suffering it brought, for in the end none of it actually mattered, and we all faded into myth and legend as much as we broke the empire. We were all so blessed and cursed, as Mashala, the now mythical queen of Naxia, once told me. Tragic houses built by broken men and ambitious women. So now, when I look back on those days and push our lofty goals aside, I am often faced with the harsh reality that all we brought was suffering, and sometimes suffering is just suffering. It doesn't strengthen you, and it doesn't build character. It simply hurts. Yours faithfully, Princess Oshelila, Ravenclaw, Countess of Oshelila, so our story can be told. Part 1. The Great Game. It was long ago, but I still remember the ghost of a smile Emma gave me as she turned a card face up and tapped it. But it is the most perilous of games, Atia. Where you see cards in a game, I see my opponent and their will, Emma sniffed, turning another card. I remember remaining silent, eyes fixed on the table. Emma was as much a master at the game of empire as she was at the great game. Indeed, both were the same in her opinion. The king and a pawn. Tell me, Atia, which one is more valuable, the king for his wealth and power, or the pawn for his lack of either? Frowning at them, I shrugged. The answer was obvious, even to a novice court girl. Each has their value, but the pawn may move unseen where the king may not, I answered, placing a princess and a king to counter her play, earning an amused sniff from Emma as she placed a third card. If that is true, then why have a king? Can the right pawn not make or unmake either? Emma replied, tapping the image of a sword. It was a middle card, that pawns and kings could wield alike, so I played mine. Each has their own worth, and each their place, but none are worth anything more than the will to move them, I answered, as all court girls would, placing my tower card on the table, then blushed when Emma chuckled, turning 3 more cards. Tapping the maiden, and then the 2 generals, Emma let her laughter fade into a thin smile. Each card's meaning was not lost on me, considering my parents. All were illegitimate cards, with no fixed allegiance. All that aside, she held a winning hand, but still I played my knights in a desperate bid to gain ground. Emma just sniffed. While you all play empire with kings and queens, knights and courtiers, I am just as happy to play with pawns and cards considered less worthy. The great game is no less like this, Emma said, eyes narrowed as she placed a shepherd card on the table and then another. In our game of empire, that had sealed my fate. She had played the people and her general against my empire with the maiden to crown herself queen. The maiden may take a crown, and the generals may take your pawns and depose a king, but the shepherd, it is the least of cards in the game, Atia, and that is why you must be most wary of it. It represents the people, and they will tear you down faster than any army should you prove unworthy, and they find one more so. The Diary of Princess Atia Oshelila, Ravenclaw, Countess of Oshelila. Chapter 1. Brothers of the Raven. But Atia, if I knew then what I know now, I would have rejoiced in my fear, revelled in our struggle, and succoured the pain, my sister once told me. I disagreed. I told her, if I had known what was to come, I would have simply run away. The Diary of Princess Atia Oshelila, Ravenclaw, Countess of Oshelila. How loud can a drop of water be? Gar grumbled, flicking an irritated glance back up the alley. Like most of the run-down buildings in the poor quarter near the river's edge, the guttering along Gar's chosen alley needed some serious repair, although he could not truly complain now that persistent rain from an hour earlier had melted into a dense, soupy mist, providing him with the cover he so desired. But that drip, Gar growled, working to ignore its incessant patter, and wiping his face to clear the moisture condensing on his skin. The constant tapping on cobbles and rotten barrels worked to strain his hearing and mask the sleepy murmur of the city. Not that many would be out this time of night, but there was work to do, and his guild fee was begging due again. What else can I do? Rad's guild keepers will have my skin this time if I don't cough up, but a little murder and a touch of robbery will see that put to rest. Not that Gar actually enjoyed killing. The fact is, I don't really mind it either. Honestly, it just makes robbing a little more convenient, he mused, straining at the night sounds filtering through the haze. Grab them from behind, a quick slip of the knife from ear to ear, keeping a hand over their mouth until they stop kicking, of course, and then, well, plenty of time to pick through their pockets, and who needs to leave a witness to run to the night's watch? Besides, a man's got to earn a living somehow. It was a callous thought, really, but Gar was a simple man in his opinion. Well, a simple man with a knife and a gambling problem. But what are morals to the likes of me? It's not like I can eat them. So tonight, he lurked among the barrels and refuse at an alley entrance. Which one in the twisted maze of streets by the docks, he was not sure, but it stank of piss, dead things, and rotting cabbage. Why do they always smell of cabbage? He thought absently, his mind drifting through simple boredom. It was not a question he had an answer to, but it did not really matter. They all did, and besides, it masked his own fragrance. Pressed against the slippery rain-wet wall, hidden by the gloom, he was just another indistinct shape in the misty dark. It was the perfect hiding spot, really, now that a dense mist drifted in off the river sill, to soften the edges, dampen the sound, and lengthen the shadows. Honestly, the night could not have been more perfect for a robbery. Yet it had provided little chance to earn his living, he lamented, adjusting his rope belt. His stomach was empty and growling, which went a long way to explain his less-than-usual caution as the hours stretched on with little chance to ply his trade. Close to giving up, and hoping to beg a little change in the morning while avoiding Rad's fee-collectors, he took a sharp breath at the tell-tale click of boots on worn cobbles. They were close, far closer than they should have been before Gar marked them, prompting a grimace of disgust at his loss of attention, having almost missed them in his musings and the mist-muffled night. Sighing in relief, he focused the best he could as little butterflies of fear swarmed in his belly. Or is that just hunger? Gar thought, his instincts balanced between flight and fight. But it did not really matter, if it gave him caution. It paid to be careful regardless of the hunger, for Shăr at night was a dangerous place after all. Hands pressed against the slick wet wall, knife at the ready, he crouched, poised on the balls of his feet, muscles tensing and relaxing, eager to get the job done and out of the damp. Straining at the milky lamplit street, he saw little at first aside from a dark shadow, until a man of above-average height materialized out of the mist. His face was unremarkable, except for a scar that ran from just under his right eye to his lower jaw. A heavy hooded grey woolen cloak, worn to beat back the winter damp, covered long black hair framing ice-blue eyes that held an air of danger about the man as he moved with the fluid grace that only hard fighting men displayed. "Good. I need a new cloak," Gar chuckled, missing the warning signs. Gripping his knife, he counted his heartbeats as the man walked past before he lunged for his latest victim, and that is where it all went terribly wrong. Gar felt a very sharp sensation in his gut before he hit the ground with an explosion of air. Panic thoughts swarmed in his head as the last thing he would ever see arrived in the shape of a very long knife slammed into his throat and up into his brain with a crunch and a wet smack. Tugging his dagger free, the man stepped back and quickly glanced around the street for more assailants. Upon seeing no immediate danger, he cursed at the mist-shrouded night. "Shăr, what a shithole," Callus muttered, and shook his head, catching the stench at the dingy alley. Crouching, with a sigh of disgust, he cleaned the blood from his dagger on the thief's cooling corpse. "Poor fool, you were probably expecting a drunken sailor or a merchant, not a war-hardened veteran," Callus whispered, giving the rag-clad cut-purse a crooked smile and tossing a small copper coin on the former thief's chest. "Ormu owns you all," he intoned, resuming his journey toward the river. It was not long before Callus stood outside a tavern, warm light spilling onto the foggy street through cloudy windows. Above the door hung a crude sign of a woman leaning on a keg, tankard in hand. "The Drunken Wench," it read. But it was nothing remarkable, and just one of a dozen or more run-down taverns and alehouses along the wharf district, with equally predictable names and equally awful wine or ale. It was filled, for what it was worth, with local fishermen playing dice and sailors on shore leave or waiting for a new ship. Pipe smoke drifted heavily in the room, much like the river mist outside, and the air tasted like the inside of a mouldy boot. At the bar, a short, bald, piggy-eyed fellow, sporting an apron that at one time may have been white, occupied himself with cleaning a none-too-clean mug with a cloth in no better condition than his apron. The man eyed Callus as he entered the common room, looking all too much like a hermit crab that had lost its shell. "I only got ale. I ain't got no wine. It be 2 coppers, it's young, and no food at this hour. Drink it, or not, you pay or be gone," the man barked in that predictable dockside pathos, common to all wharf-side taverns and bars. Frowning back, Callus kept a hard-eyed stare on the tavern-keeper until the man began looking rather nervous. "I would have expected a tavern to serve wine, "Bad ale it is, then," Callus retorted, breaking the tension with a smile that never quite touched his eyes and radiated all the warmth of a winter river. Chuckling at the startled look on the tavern-keeper's face, he found a seat in the back corner where he could keep watch on the door and as many of the occupants as possible. Noting a familiar sharp-faced hooded fellow near the fire smoking a pipe, Callus twitched a smile in recognition, then frowned as the tavern-keeper dumped an earthen mug containing a suspiciously oily liquid on the table. Raising an eyebrow at the crude approximation of ale, Callus bestowed the tavern-keeper with another icy look. Sniffing at the murky mess slowly coming to rest in the dirty mug, he tossed 2 coppers on the greasy table, which the man scooped up and scuttled off with. Ignoring the ale, he simply observed the patrons for a time in the dingy space, before the common room door opened to reveal a slim form in a heavy hooded cloak. 2 much larger men, not doing a particularly good job at hiding the fact that they were armed to the teeth, followed the hooded stranger into the tavern. Shoving a drunken patron out of the way, they ploughed a path through the tables for their slender charge. Both had the typical light olive skin common to the inhabitants of the southern lands of Nindi and Shăr, if the plain curved swords and slave brands did not reveal their origins. "Charn slave soldiers," Callus noted with a grunt, eyeing the pair, impressive to look at, and a truly expensive purchase to make at the Southgate market, but they were mostly ornamental and generally not very bright. However, his client had the coin, it would seem. Scanning the common room, the trio pushed their way through the tables of drunken and dice-playing patrons toward him. "You are known as Callus Ravenclaw?" asked a soft, melodious voice, edged with just the smallest hint of a southern Shărian accent. "My master has a task for you," the soft voice of a girl behind the hood said as she took a seat, revealing a hint of a gold band around her delicate wrist when she placed her slender hands on the table. "A female house slave, and an expensive one, no doubt. So the client is a caste noble," Callus mused. Typical. The Shăr aristocrats would never demean themselves to come to a place like this, nor in fact risk it. "What sort of task?" Callus asked in a level voice, steadying the 2 guards who simply ignored him. The slave gave him a half smile, obviously noting his appraisal of her 2 charn men. They would be there as much for her protection as for stopping her from running away. "My master asks that you obtain certain items is all, and the compensation will be more than adequate, I am told," the girl said crisply, earning little more than a raised eyebrow from Callus. "No, not a girl. You are young, but no girl," Callus thought, appraising the slender thing hidden under the hood. "Hey, you 3!" shouted the landlord, his voice rousing a few of his sleepy patrons from their half-slumber. "We only got ale at this hour. There be no wine, no food, and ye be paying or ye be gone. I'll have no lechers staying in here to get out of the fog," he growled, slapping his rag on the scarred and worn bar top. Flicking a hostile glance at the piggy-eyed fellow, the young woman whispered something to one of her guards, who shrugged and tossed a small coin bag to the landlord. The man's eyes widened when he looked inside, and with a startled look, quickly followed by a surprised smile, he scuttled off to fetch mugs, all the while clutching the tiny bag tightly. "Back to business?" the young slave said, flashing Callus a thin smile, clearly dismissing the landlord's existence. Callus could not help but smile back. The woman was calm, confident, and utterly sure she would be obeyed without question. "No, not your typical slave girl, now are you?" he thought, catching a glimpse of raven-black hair. She would fetch an astonishingly high price at market, which narrowed down the list of potential clients considerably. The slave was certainly young, her face half hidden inside the hood, delicate and beautiful. But the blue of her eyes held a hard yet haunted edge. They had seen much, it would seem, in her short years, he noted, letting the silence draw out a little longer before he answered the slave. It paid to be careful in Shăr, because you could get tangled in some very nasty webs dealing with the caste nobles, if you were unwary. "Burglary, is it?" Callus sighed, and shook his head, clearly not all that interested. "If we like the conditions, then we will obtain the items your master seeks. But I have a few, as I said, conditions that must be met first." The slave girl eyed him as the landlord scuttled up with 3 mugs, and just as quickly scuttled away. The hooded woman ignored the oily ale, her eyes fixed on Callus, expression devoid of all emotion. He had seen this before with other slaves. It was not unlike the skills applied by noblewomen who played the great game of house. Yet, with slaves, they learned to bury their emotions for simple survival. Conditions were expected from one such as yourself. The guild stressed you would be careful and very discreet, she answered flatly, before tossing a wax-sealed slip of parchment over the table to Callus. You will be at that address the first hour after the middle day tomorrow, and we shall discuss the conditions in more. She paused and smiled. It was cold and never touched her eyes. Pleasant surroundings, she continued, waving a slender hand at the oily ale with a look of distaste. The action was the only genuine emotion Callus saw from the woman before she gave a sharp nod and left the table, leaving her 2 guards in comical unison to sniff their ale, grimace, and leave their mugs to follow their charge. Leaning back against his chair, Callus sighed as he watched the lithe beauty leave the tavern. Something about her face tickled his memory, but that was of little importance, as his mind focused on the guild job. There were many slaves in the Western Empire, and dark hair and blue eyes were not uncommon among them. But still, you have a familiar look, he mused, then shoved it away, as recognition tickled at his sense of caution. There were other, more pressing matters than an indentured noble girl, as pretty as she was. Another noble feud, Callus sniffed, but it did not really matter. The caste elite played their games, and if you were careful, you profited from those games. The problem here was obvious, and his brother would be blunt in pointing it out. This would be no simple burglary, for if it were, the guild would have passed it off to the thieves. Guild? Bah, don't make me sick. You are little more than a disparate gang of thieves, frauds, and protection racketeers. But they had a code, and by the by, the shady underworld stuck to it or got their throats slit. Each city had one, with the possible exception of Oshelila in the east, but that was immaterial, Callus mused. If you wanted to work, then you followed their code and paid your dues. Gods, Callus, could this look any more like a set-up? A sharp-faced man, with long black hair loosely tied with a simple leather strip, sighed as he sat at Callus's table. Promptly picking up a mug, he gulped its oily contents, then thumped the mug down and settled an unhappy look on Callus. Vexian, how can you drink that cat piss? Callus grimaced, an amused smile cracking his stony features. Well, Vexian retorted, open my mouth and swallow. You can't taste it until you stop, and don't change the bloody subject. This looks like a set-up to me, snarled Vexian. Gracing him with a chuckle, Callus sniffed his own mug and put it back down. You, old friend, are a brave man, Callus shuddered, pushing the mug aside. But to answer your question, I don't like it either. Meeting here in a wharfside tavern? Not the best place to keep a secret, but maybe a second meeting in this case makes more sense. The messenger from Rad said that the client was a little paranoid. Grunting at the question, Vexian shot Callus a flat look, then shrugged. Maybe, Vexian replied noncommittally, grabbing another mug. Look, Rad gave us nothing to go on, Cal, and add to the fact it is us and not some footpad being called up has me nervous, Vexian sniffed, placing the second mug on the table and reaching for the third. Looks like caste nobles, if that slave girl and her designer guards are any measure of it. Frowning at the oily liquid, Vexian placed the mug back down and pointed a finger at Callus, clearly irritated. Which means we ask for double the money because you know damn well if it is caste nobles, then it means more than double the problems we have to deal with, brother. I am as sick of escorting wagons and merchants as you are, but this job stinks worse than the city, Vexian hissed, all mirth gone as he tapped the slip of paper. So, are you going to open that? Callus eyed the parchment before picking it up to crack the plain red wax seal. Scanning its contents, his eyes widened just slightly when he read the address. Pleasant surroundings indeed, Callus scoffed, tossing it to Vexian, who curled his lip when he read it. If that is who I think it is, ask for triple and up front, Cal. The Duke of Shăr is an insufferable prick, and less trustworthy than a cut-purse, Vexian groaned. Either way, you want me to follow them, I gather. There was no question of it, really. Vexian would do exactly that, and Callus could count on it. Follow them for sure, and get as much information as you can before dawn, replied Callus. Sniffing at the message and its sparse contents, Vexian tossed it onto the table. Rad is not trustworthy, Cal. We both know that, but he would be cutting his own throat if he double-crossed us, and the rest of the guild would flay him alive if we did not slit his throat first. As it is, my network here in Shăr is small, brother, but I will dig up what I can before dawn, Vexian sighed, inclining his head at Callus, who made a disgusted sound at the comment, and rolled his eyes to the grimy smoke-stained tavern roof. True, but you know the game. Emma will have some contacts here if you really get stuck, Callus replied, screwing the message into a ball and tossing it into his ale mug. Snorting at the name, Vexian shook his head, dismissing it. Some? That woman will have half the city on her payroll. But no, I would avoid Emma. She will demand conditions upon conditions, and then some if we do. Best we avoid that, Vexian replied flatly, and stood, his all-too-ready smile returning as he left. See you in a few hours, Cal. Watching his brother leave, Callus gave him a wry smile. Vexian was not a man anyone sane would want to waylay on a night like this, but he was right about Emma, and neither wanted to get tangled in her webs again. I love you as a sister and more, Emlalia, but neither of us trust you, Callus mused, thinking of the raven-haired beauty. He had known Emma as a rag-clothed child and loved her from the day she staggered into his adopted father's camp, but Vexian, the man was his constant companion and brother in all but name. In Vexian's own words, he was the best thief Callus knew, aside from their sister Catla. Handy with a knife, the sharp-faced man could creep up on a cat, but most of all, Vexian was one of only a handful of men Callus trusted, even if he was a thief and a cutthroat. They might as well have been brothers. Hell, they could be, for all they knew. Growing up in an Axian slum, it did not really matter. Only the strong and nimble survived to be adults, and besides, most street urchins were the sons and daughters of nameless whores anyway. None of it really mattered, Callus thought, chuckling to himself, as the memory of their childhood stealing and picking pockets to survive came flooding back in. They had a job beyond guarding merchants' wagons, and that was all that counted. I'm getting far too old for this. Why do we keep doing it? We don't need to, Callus muttered as he got up to leave. Time to return home to little Oshelila and mother after this. We've both been away for far too long, he whispered, and snorted at the thought. They would both be bored in a month, and on the road again if they did that. The landlord tracked him with piggy eyes as Callus started for the exit and the less chewy air of the dockside road. Lifting an eyebrow at the man's sullen look, Callus shook his head and tossed a silver coin at him as he passed the bar. Put it back in your vats, man. That ale is still fermenting, and on your life, do not serve that swill to the guild. They would likely hang you from your own door sign before the night's watch gets a chance. Outside, the mist swirled in clumps as a light dusting of snow worked to replace it. I never did like this city, Vexian, and the nobles here least of all, Callus sniffed, slipping into the mist beyond the milky light of the tavern's windows. Stalking through the shadows that lined the narrow lane, Vexian curled a tight smile at the trio slipping through a heavy iron-shod door. The grand entrance to the extensive palace would likely open onto the city's water square on the avenue leading up to the imperial palace. But back here, in the narrow lane, a block away from the marble facades and manicured gardens, the walls were plain local stone, pitted and stained from neglect. Much like Shăr and its nobility, Vexian snarled, eyeing the solid door the slave girl and her guards pulled shut, all pretty on the outside, but rotting from within. It was only the truth, in Vexian's opinion. Shăr, both as an empire and the city that gave it its name, was rotten to the core and corrupt beyond redemption. Dismissing thoughts of the empire and the nobility that ruled it, he slipped over the cobbled lane to the palace wall. The slave girl and her designer guards had taken quite the detour in arriving at their destination, but of the two stops they made, it was the one at a guild safe house that truly piqued Vexian's interest. What dealings would Helsus have with the guild? And why this servant's entrance? He mused, curling his lip at the thought of Helsus, Duke of Shăr. Just what are you hiding, girl? Vexian whispered at the dark, worrying at the thought, his instincts tickling his sense of caution. It was a troubling question, considering the shady underworld of this city, or any city for that matter, avoided its local lord at all costs. He would have to dig for that answer through his own small network of spies and informants, but that would take time, and time was a commodity he was short on. Damn it, Callus. I have a bad feeling about this job. Houses is not a man I want to get that close to, and you know damn well if he is playing the great game, then Ema will be involved somehow. I don't fancy getting stuck between the two of them. Vexian snarled, his own street-born instincts sounding the alarm, as he made his way along the palace wall to the door. House's Abvander was an insufferable prick, in Vexian's opinion. Not that he'd actually met the man. His reputation simply preceded him. To Vexian, Houses was just another over-pampered noble with little care for those around him. But Ema Oshelila, that woman's name brought uncomfortable memories, all equally good and bad. I have no desire to get tangled in your webs again, Ema. They tend to get people killed, he mused, and shoved the thoughts aside as he pushed on the door. But it did not budge, and with no discernible lock to pick, he quickly gave up on it. Eyeing the palace wall, Vexian shook his head at the height before any window or landing appeared. No climbing that without being seen, he whispered, and set off back the way he had come, seeking an entrance to the maze of halls and corridors below Shār's filthy streets. Like many of the ancient cities of the Middle Kingdoms, Shăr was honeycombed with passages that ran in and out of the sewers and cellars, mixed among the remnants of much older settlements. The Thief's Highway, some called it, but in reality only the guild used it, or those given permission by them to shelter in its warrens. To say Shăr was old did not even remotely portray the city's true age. Founded nearly 3,000 years past, after the collapse of the Old One's empire, the city had seen destruction at least twice, and more than one dynasty deposed. Only Talan and Mengia, along with Oshelila, rivaled Shăr in age, and all three were riddled with deep passages. Pushing aside his musings, Vexian dipped into an alley and carefully shifted aside an iron grate in the grimy cobbles. The dirty shaft it covered reeked, but it would lead him to where he needed to go, and few but the most desperate, or those who truly did not want to be seen, would wade through the sewage revealed at the bottom. Growling at the stench, he lowered himself into the dirty hole, trying not to gag at the smell. "You owe me for this, brother," Vexian growled, feeling his boots squelching the dirty rivulet trickling through the bottom. In many ways, Shăr was a little different from Tolnaxia, where he and Callus grew up. Both cities were dirty and old, and Tolnaxia, just like Shăr, was a crime-ridden dump, in Vexian's opinion. In all likelihood, he and Callus would have ended on the gallows as thieves if it were not for the First Aeonian Crusade, and being press-ganged into service by Tolnaxia's local lord. There, they had found a new life and a family, and we squandered that life, brother, Vexian mused absently, feeling his way carefully through the dark, back toward the palace, with only the stub of a tallow candle to light his way. Stumbling through the slippery dark passage, it took him much longer than he wished to find an outlet from the palace privy into the stinking tunnel. Growling at the filth-smeared and rusted iron grate blocking the entrance, Vexian stepped back and eyed the way he had come. "Not getting in this way either," he sighed, glancing back down the stinking shaft. "Damn it, Callus. I don't like places I can't get out of in a hurry, and I have a bad feeling we are going to need to." Sniffing at the blocked entrance, then grimacing at the smell, he set off back toward the alley. It took him the better part of an hour to slip through the tunnels, back streets and alleys of Shăr to the little guild safe house the slave girl paid a call on. The place was silent and shuttered tight against the night chill, yet something felt off about the house. No fire lit, and no one is home. Vexian frowned, narrowing his eyes at the chimney stacks on either side of the tall building. There were always guild keepers in these places that never slept, even if the guild hierarchy moved around each day to avoid the city guard and the ruling family's secret police. On near silent feet, he climbed a shabby wooden fence to the stables. The building would have been an inn or a tavern at one time, if not some wealthy merchant's home. But now it was just another run-down building among dozens of others that edged the western side of the city near the river. Reaching the back edge of the building, he smiled a little at the low light spilling from the shabby stable doors. "So there are occupants, but why the stables?" he thought, frowning at the dim glow filtering through the cracks in the wooden doors and walls. Keeping to the edge of the overgrown grounds, he worked his way toward the decaying structure, noting the low murmur of voices within. Crouching low, he put an eye to a long crack in a grey and weather-beaten board. "Temple rats," Vexian growled, eyeing 4 plainly dressed men sleeping in the space, and 2 others talking in low voices near the fire. To the unobservant, the group would look like any other company of mercenary guards, but Vexian knew better. Their weapons and armour gave the game away. No one other than an Aeonian temple knight or guard would be foolish, or in fact stupid enough to wear it. No matter the plain clothes the men wore, the pommels of their swords and the shape of their helms were distinctively those of the Aeonian temple. "Just what are you doing in Shăr?" Vexian pondered, pulling away from the long crack. "But more to the point, what has that slave girl got to do with you?" The thought was as troubling as it was irritating. Vexian had no love for the temple, and none for those who trafficked with it. The Aeonian religion was outlawed in much of Shăr, as it was in Naxia, and rightly so, considering the fanatical faith had caused no less than 2 holy wars in the past 30 years, and scores of others in the past centuries. Placing his eye back to the crack, Vexian gritted his teeth and quickly moved away from the stable. "And a temple priest is with them. Just why would you risk coming to Shăr?" Vexian pondered, making his way back toward the southern gate and the little inn he and Callus had chosen. "If Halsis thinks we will work with those temple rats, he is sorely mistaken." The temple had about as much love for him and his brother as they had for the temple. Yet it was all conjecture. Vexian had no evidence the slave girl had come here to see these temple men, and it could be simple coincidence, considering many in the guild and those who work for them met in these places. Coincidence? Maybe, but it would be stupid to simply dismiss it as such, he thought, casting a glance back at the silent building. But then again, we both have prices on our heads in Aeonia, Callus, and we've not been that shy about being noticed in Shăr, yet temple rats hiding in a guild house? Vexian narrowed his eyes at the thought, then shrugged. Gold is gold, after all, and every man, or indeed guild, has its price, he whispered, yet he could not quite dispel the growing knot of worry at what he had seen. The guild would never have worked with the temple in the past, and Halsis? It did not really surprise Vexian all that much. The imperial family was as degenerate as it was corrupt, well, in his opinion. The only thing that holds the temple back from outright ruling Aeonia is Queen Orissa and her sister Vera, and thank Alyssa they do, Vexian sniffed, invoking the goddess of creation, love, and wisdom. King Tibius is not fit to rule a midden heap, let alone a kingdom, he growled, thinking of the incompetent king of Aeonia. The man was an imbecile, and a violent one in his opinion, but the arranged marriage of Mishala, Queen of Naxia's cousin, Orissa, had at least maintained some sort of peace, if not true freedom, for the people of Aeonia. Then again, is the imperial throne of Shăr any better? The emperor is a violent, senile old man. It is his son, Owen, or his cousin Halsis, who truly rule the empire, Vexian mused, then grunted at the thought. If not you two, then it is Zirana, Eima's niece, who holds the power here. Thinking of the young woman brought a frown of consternation to Vexian's brow as he made his way down a side avenue toward the southern gate, working to avoid the night traffic weaving its way into the city. The girl was a constant irritation to Eima, and rightly so in his opinion. "I killed her mother for you, Eima, and I doubt not Zirana would return the act in kind if she gets the chance. She is known as the Spider for a good reason. That girl's webs are no less deadly than yours." With the knot of worry increasing, and his instinct sounding an alarm, Vexian shoved the inn door open and headed for the innkeeper's chambers. The man was part of his own network, but best of all, in contact with Eima's, and as much as Vexian wished to avoid the woman and her games, he needed her information.